Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back 700 years to experience personal hygiene in medieval Europe. And I promise you, the smell alone would send you running back to your modern shower within minutes. Picture this. You're waking up in a cramped medieval dwelling where the concept of daily bathing doesn't exist, deodorant won't be invented for another 6 centuries, and the overwhelming stench of unwashed human bodies, rotting food, and animal waste creates an atmosphere so thick you can practically taste it. Your own body odor has reached levels that would clear a modern restaurant, but everyone around you smells exactly the same. So this horrific funk is just considered normal background ambiance in 14th century life. The reality is that medieval hygiene practices were so inadequate and dangerous that you'd probably die from preventable diseases within weeks, assuming the smell didn't kill you first. Medieval people had no understanding of bacteria, infection, disease transmission, or even basic cleanliness concepts that modern 5-year-olds take for granted. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop that in the comments, and let's see how this medieval hygiene nightmare is reaching across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're not a noble with access to servants and luxury items. You're an ordinary person living in medieval Europe, where personal cleanliness is considered suspicious, possibly heretical, and definitely unnecessary for daily survival. Your body hasn't been fully washed in months, and the last time you attempted anything resembling a bath was probably last summer, when you accidentally fell into a river while working. The medieval understanding of hygiene was fundamentally different from modern concepts, because people believed that washing too frequently would weaken your body's natural defenses and make you more susceptible to disease. This wasn't just ignorance. It was established medical doctrine, taught by physicians who genuinely believed that dirt and body oils provided protective barriers against illness. Your morning routine begins with the overwhelming assault on your senses as you become conscious of your own smell, which has developed into a complex bouquet of fermented sweat, unwashed hair, rotting teeth, and various bodily secretions that have been accumulating for weeks. But this is just the beginning of your hygiene journey, because medieval life is about to present you with challenges that would horrify anyone accustomed to modern sanitation standards. The air in your dwelling is thick with the accumulated odors of multiple unwashed people, cooking smoke, animal waste, and decomposing organic matter that creates an atmosphere so toxic it would violate every modern health code ever written. You're about to discover that medieval hygiene wasn't just unpleasant, it was literally deadly. Your attempt to perform what modern people would consider basic morning hygiene reveals the shocking truth about medieval bathing practices. Most people went their entire lives without ever submerging their bodies in clean water. You stumble toward your washing station, which consists of a small wooden bowl containing water that's been sitting stagnant for days, developing a film of bacteria and mysterious floating particles that would make any modern person gag at first sight. The medieval belief system around bathing was rooted in genuine care of water's effects on the human body. Medical authorities taught that washing removed essential body oils that protected against disease, and that hot water opened pores to allow evil humors and pestilence to enter the bloodstream. This wasn't superstition. This was established scientific doctrine, supported by the church and medical establishment, making regular bathing not just unnecessary, but actively dangerous to your health. Your washing routine involves splashing small amounts of cold, contaminated water on your face and hands, while avoiding any contact with the rest of your body. Medieval people practiced what they called dry cleaning, which involved changing their linen undergarments when possible, and hoping that fresh cloth would absorb some of the accumulated filth from their skin. Unfortunately, clean linen was expensive, and most people owned only 1 or 2 sets of underclothes that were worn until they literally disintegrated. The water you're using for this minimal cleaning has been drawn from local sources that serve multiple purposes. drinking water for humans and animals, sewage disposal, industrial waste removal, and general-purpose cleaning for everything from laundry to butchering livestock. This multi-use water system ensures that every drop you splash on your face contains bacteria, parasites, and toxic substances that would be considered hazardous waste by modern standards. Medieval bathing facilities, when they existed at all, were communal affairs where dozens of people shared the same water in large wooden tubs. The water was rarely changed between users, meaning that each person who entered the bath was soaking in the accumulated dirt, bodily fluids, and diseases of everyone who came before them. These communal baths were essentially disease incubators that spread infections faster than any other medieval institution. The few wealthy individuals who could afford private baths used water heated over open fires in large cauldrons. But even these luxury bathing experiences involved water that hadn't been purified or treated in any way. Rich people were simply washing themselves in cleaner versions of the same contaminated water sources that everyone else used, making their superior hygiene practices only marginally less dangerous than the common person's complete avoidance of bathing. Soap existed in medieval times, but it was made from animal fats and wood ash, using processes that created harsh, caustic substances that often damaged skin more than they cleaned it. This medieval soap was expensive, difficult to obtain, and so harsh that frequent use could cause chemical burns and skin infections that were worse than the original dirt. Your morning washing ritual is completed within minutes because there's simply nothing more you can do without access to clean water, proper soap, or cultural knowledge about effective hygiene practices. Historians still argue whether medieval people's aversion to bathing was primarily driven by medical beliefs or practical limitations. But you're experiencing both problems simultaneously. Your mouth feels like a medieval battlefield where bacteria have been waging war for months, and your attempt at dental hygiene reveals why most medieval people had lost half their teeth by age 30, and suffered from breath so foul it could literally repel attackers during combat. You reach for your dental care supplies, which consist of a frayed willow twig that you've been using as a toothbrush for weeks, and a handful of herbs that might help mask the overwhelming stench of decay emanating from your rotting mouth. Medieval dental hygiene was based on the revolutionary concept of occasionally scraping food particles from between your teeth using whatever pointed object happened to be available. Knife tips, wooden splinters, animal bones, or metal picks that often caused more damage than the original dental problems. The willow twig you're chewing represents cutting-edge dental technology because the fibrous wood contains natural salicylic acid that provides mild antibacterial benefits, though this accidental chemistry was completely unknown to medieval people who simply enjoyed the sensation of gnawing on wood. Your teeth are already displaying the characteristic medieval dental problems that claimed more lives than warfare. Massive cavities that expose nerve endings to constant agony, abscesses that spread infection throughout your bloodstream, and gum disease so severe that your teeth are literally falling out of your skull. Medieval diets were surprisingly high in sugar from honey and fruit, but completely lacking in the nutritional knowledge needed to prevent tooth decay through proper oral care. The medieval understanding of dental health blamed toothaches on tiny worms that burrowed into teeth and had to be removed through various torture techniques involving heated metal instruments, toxic chemicals, and prayers to saints who specialized in dental miracles. These toothworms were considered real parasites rather than metaphors, and medieval dentistry focused on extracting these imaginary creatures through methods that guaranteed severe infection and often death from blood poisoning. Your breakfast routine involves chewing on bread so coarse and filled with grit that every bite literally grinds your teeth down to nubs, creating rough surfaces that trap food particles and bacteria in ways that ensure constant dental decay. Medieval grain was ground using stone mills that left tiny rock particles in flour, making every meal an exercise in mechanical tooth destruction that would horrify modern dentists. Tooth extraction was performed by barbers, blacksmiths, and other tradespeople who had no medical training but possessed the physical strength needed to rip infected teeth from people's skulls, using crude metal tools and no anesthesia. These procedures were conducted in unsanitary conditions that virtually guaranteed fatal infections, making dental problems one of the leading causes of death in medieval Europe. The wealthy could afford slightly better dental care in the form of imported spices and herbs that provided mild antiseptic benefits. But even noble families suffered from dental problems that would be easily prevented by modern children's oral hygiene routines. Historians still argue whether medieval dental health was worse in urban or rural areas, but you're experiencing the universal nature of dental decay that affected everyone, regardless of social status. Your mouth pain is constant and severe, interfering with eating, sleeping, and basic conversation, while the infection from your dental abscesses is spreading through your lymph nodes and threatening to reach your heart or brain, where it would kill you within days of developing serious complications. Your clothing represents a fascinating archaeological experiment in how fabric can absorb and preserve human filth across months or even years of continuous wear, creating garments that have essentially become wearable petri dishes cultivating every form of bacteria, fungi, and parasites known to medieval Europe. You're wearing the same linen tunic, woolen hose, and outer garments that you put on months ago. And they've gradually transformed from clothing into biological hazmat suits that would be classified as dangerous waste by any modern health authority. Medieval laundry practices were so infrequent and ineffective that most people's clothing became permanent repositories of accumulated sweat, food stains, bodily fluids, and environmental contamination that created ideal breeding conditions for disease-carrying organisms. The concept of regular washing simply didn't exist for ordinary people, who might wash their clothes once or twice per year, if at all, using methods that barely qualified as cleaning by any reasonable standard. Your linen undergarments, which were supposed to absorb sweat and protect your outer clothes from direct body contact, have become so saturated with accumulated perspiration and oils that they've developed a texture somewhere between fabric and leather. Medieval people believed that frequently changing underclothes provided adequate body cleaning. But when you only own 1 or 2 sets of underwear and can't afford to wash them regularly, this system fails catastrophically. The woolen outer garments you're wearing have absorbed months of cooking smoke, animal waste, industrial pollution, and human secretions, creating a complex chemical mixture that produces smells so intense they can cause nausea in anyone unfortunate enough to come within several feet of you. Wool was particularly problematic because it retained odors permanently and was difficult to clean without destroying the fabric's structure. Medieval laundry facilities consisted of communal washing areas where people beat their clothes with wooden paddles in contaminated water sources, using soap made from animal fat and ash that was so caustic it often damaged fabrics beyond repair. The washing process took enormous amounts of time and labor, making it impractical for working people who needed their clothes for daily survival and couldn't afford to spend days on laundry activities. Drying clothes in medieval environments meant exposing wet fabrics to smoke from cooking fires, dust from unpaved streets, and various airborne contaminants that negated whatever cleaning benefits the washing process might have provided. Clean clothes became dirty again within hours of the washing process, making the entire effort seem pointless to people who were struggling with basic survival needs. The wealthy could afford to own multiple sets of clothing and hire servants to handle laundry duties. But even luxury medieval garments were subject to the same fundamental problems of inadequate cleaning methods and contaminated water sources. Rich people's clothes were simply cleaner versions of the same filthy textiles that everyone else wore, providing minimal health benefits despite the enormous expense involved. Color and decoration in medieval clothing served partly to mask stains and wear patterns that were inevitable when garments couldn't be properly cleaned. Dark colors, complex patterns, and heavy embroidery helped disguise the accumulated filth that made all medieval clothing essentially unwearable by modern standards. Historians still argue whether medieval clothing practices were primarily driven by economic constraints or cultural attitudes toward cleanliness. But you're experiencing the practical reality that clean clothes were simply impossible to maintain under medieval living conditions, making everyone's wardrobe a walking advertisement for the complete failure of contemporary hygiene systems. Your digestive system is demanding relief, which means you must venture to the communal latrine facility that serves as a perfect example of why medieval people died from preventable diseases at rates that would constitute genocide by modern standards. The medieval toilet experience is about to introduce you to sanitation concepts so horrifying that you'll understand why dysentery, cholera, and various intestinal parasites were considered normal parts of daily life, rather than preventable health disasters. Medieval toilet facilities consisted of wooden seats, positioned over deep pits that were shared by entire neighborhoods, creating concentrated repositories of human waste that attracted disease-carrying insects, contaminated groundwater supplies, and produced toxic gases that could literally asphyxiate users who spent too long in the facility. These communal latrines were built without any understanding of waste management, disease transmission, or basic sanitation principles that would be obvious to modern elementary school children. Your toilet paper consists of whatever materials happen to be available: leaves, moss, fabric scraps, or smooth stones, none of which provide effective cleaning, while all of them introduce additional bacteria and contamination to your already compromised hygiene situation. Medieval people had no concept of anal cleanliness, viewing thorough cleaning as unnecessary luxury rather than basic health maintenance, which guaranteed that everyone carried fecal contamination on their bodies and clothing at all times. The latrine structure itself is a breeding ground for every form of parasite and pathogen known to medieval medicine, plus several dozen species that wouldn't be identified by science for another 6 centuries. Flies move freely between the waste pit and nearby food preparation areas, creating efficient disease transmission networks that ensured stomach ailments were chronic conditions rather than occasional illnesses. Medieval waste disposal involved simply allowing human excrement to accumulate in pits until they overflowed, at which point the contents were either covered with dirt or dumped into local water sources that also served as drinking water for the community. This system guaranteed that everyone was constantly consuming water contaminated with human waste, making intestinal infections unavoidable facts of life rather than preventable diseases. The smell emanating from medieval toilet facilities was so intense that it could be detected from hundreds of yards away, creating olfactory landmarks that helped people navigate through cities and towns. This overwhelming stench wasn't just unpleasant. It represented concentrated airborne bacteria and toxic gases that caused respiratory problems and spread diseases through simple breathing in the vicinity of waste management areas. Privacy in medieval latrines was minimal or non-existent, with multiple people using facilities simultaneously while conducting conversations and social interactions that would be unthinkable in modern bathroom contexts. This communal approach to elimination meant that everyone was exposed to everyone else's diseases, parasites, and bodily functions in ways that maximized contamination and disease transmission. Hand washing after toilet use was limited to whatever water might be available near the latrine, which was typically the same contaminated water source that received waste disposal, making the cleaning process essentially meaningless for infection prevention. Medieval people had no understanding of the connection between fecal contamination and disease transmission, so proper hand hygiene was never developed as a health practice. Historians still argue whether medieval sanitation problems were primarily caused by overpopulation or inadequate technology, but you're experiencing the deadly combination of both factors that created toilet facilities so dangerous they functioned as efficient biological weapons against entire communities. Your scalp feels like a medieval battlefield where an entire ecosystem of parasites has established permanent colonies, turning your unwashed hair into a thriving metropolis of lice, fleas, mites, and various other creatures that medieval people considered as natural and inevitable as breathing. You run your fingers through hair that hasn't been properly washed in months, feeling the distinctive movement of dozens of insects that have made your head their permanent home and are currently laying eggs, feeding on your blood, and reproducing at rates that would impress modern entomologists. Medieval hair care consisted primarily of occasional combing with crude wooden or bone implements designed to remove the largest parasites while leaving smaller ones undisturbed, creating a pest management system that was about as effective as using a pitchfork to catch minnows. The combs themselves became contaminated with parasite eggs and bacteria, spreading infestations between family members and ensuring that head lice remained permanent household residents rather than temporary visitors. Your hair has developed a texture somewhere between felt and cardboard due to the accumulated oils, dirt, food particles, and various organic substances that have been building up for months without any effective cleaning. Medieval people believed that hair oils provided protection against disease and weather, so they actively avoided washing their hair with anything more aggressive than occasional water rinses that did nothing to remove the biological buildup. The lice population living in your hair represents a complex social structure with multiple generations coexisting in the warm, moist environment of your scalp, feeding regularly on your blood and producing waste products that cause constant itching, irritation, and open wounds that become infected with additional bacteria. These head lice were so universal in medieval times that they were considered normal fauna, rather than parasitic infestations requiring treatment. Medieval lice removal techniques involved various folk remedies that ranged from ineffective to genuinely dangerous, including the application of toxic substances like mercury, arsenic compounds, and caustic plant extracts that often caused more health problems than the original parasite infestation. Professional lice removers existed in some larger towns, but their services were expensive and their methods were often more harmful than helpful. The social implications of head lice were fascinating because everyone had them, making parasite picking a common social activity performed in public settings without shame or embarrassment. Families would spend evenings removing lice from each other's hair, creating intimate bonding experiences around shared parasite management that would horrify modern people, but seemed perfectly normal in medieval contexts. Your hair also serves as a repository for various other forms of contamination, including cooking smoke, industrial pollutants, animal dander, and mysterious substances that you've encountered throughout your daily activities. Medieval hair became essentially a biological filter that trapped airborne contaminants and concentrated them against your scalp, creating localized pollution problems that affected your health through skin absorption and inhalation. Women's hair care in medieval times was particularly challenging because longer hair provided more surface area for parasite habitation and contamination accumulation, while cultural expectations required women to keep their hair covered in public, creating warm, moist environments that were ideal for bacterial growth and parasite reproduction. Historians still argue whether medieval head lice populations were primarily spread through social contact or environmental contamination, but you're experiencing the reality that everyone's hair was infested regardless of social class or personal hygiene attempts, making head parasites one of the few truly egalitarian aspects of medieval life. Your experience as a medieval woman reveals hygiene challenges so horrific that modern people would consider them medieval torture methods, particularly when it comes to managing monthly menstrual cycles using materials and methods that virtually guaranteed infection, disease, and social humiliation. Medieval feminine hygiene consisted of cloth rags that were reused for months without proper cleaning, creating ideal conditions for bacterial growth and reproductive system infections that often proved fatal. Medieval understanding of women's menstrual cycles was based on religious teachings that declared menstruation a punishment for original sin, making periods not just physically uncomfortable, but spiritually shameful experiences that required isolation from normal social activities. Women were considered ritually unclean during menstruation and were forbidden from cooking food, attending religious services, or even touching other people, creating monthly periods of social exile that compounded the physical difficulties of managing periods without modern hygiene products. Your menstrual management system consists of strips of coarse linen cloth that you salvaged from old garments and bedding, creating makeshift sanitary products that provide minimal absorption while causing constant chafing and irritation against your sensitive skin. These cloth strips cannot be properly cleaned between uses because soap is expensive and hot water is rarely available, so you're essentially reusing contaminated fabric that accumulates bacteria and develops odors that would clear a modern emergency room. The medieval belief system around menstruation included the genuinely dangerous idea that menstrual blood was toxic and could poison food, kill plants, and cause various supernatural disasters if not properly contained. This led to isolation practices that prevented women from receiving proper nutrition, medical care, or social support during their most vulnerable times, making periods significantly more dangerous than they needed to be even under medieval conditions. Medieval women's reproductive health was further compromised by the complete lack of understanding about vaginal hygiene, leading to practices that introduced additional bacteria and contamination to already vulnerable areas. Women used various folk remedies, including herbal douches made from potentially toxic plants, inserted foreign objects to absorb menstrual flow, and followed cleaning rituals that often caused more harm than benefit. The social stigma around menstruation meant that women couldn't discuss period-related health problems with male physicians, who were the only medical practitioners available in most medieval communities. This communication barrier prevented women from receiving even the inadequate medical care that was available to men, making reproductive health issues inevitably fatal when complications developed. Medieval pregnancy and childbirth hygiene practices were equally terrifying, involving midwives who had no understanding of sterile procedures and delivered babies in environments that would be considered biological hazmat zones by modern standards. The maternal mortality rate exceeded 50% in some regions, with most deaths caused by infections that could have been prevented through basic sanitation practices. Your monthly cycle is accompanied by cramping, bloating, and mood changes that medieval medicine attributed to supernatural causes rather than normal biological processes, leading to treatments that included bloodletting, toxic herbal remedies, and religious exorcisms that often made symptoms worse while providing no actual relief. Historians still argue whether medieval women's health problems were primarily caused by poor hygiene or inadequate medical knowledge. But you're experiencing the deadly combination of both factors that made being a woman in medieval times significantly more dangerous than being a man, with reproductive health issues serving as leading causes of death among women of childbearing age. Your overwhelming body odor has reached levels that would evacuate modern buildings, so you turn to the medieval solution of masking your stench with expensive perfumes and aromatic substances that create a bizarre olfactory combination of rotting flesh covered with flowery scents. Medieval perfume wasn't used to enhance natural cleanliness. It was a desperate attempt to make unwashed bodies tolerable in social situations, creating artificial fragrance layers over biological decay that fooled absolutely nobody. but made the smell slightly less likely to cause immediate vomiting. Medieval perfumes were made from exotic spices, flower essences, and animal secretions that cost more than most people earned in entire years, making pleasant smells a luxury item that only the wealthy could afford, while everyone else simply endured their natural funk. These expensive fragrances included ambergris from whale intestines, musk from deer glands, and various plant extracts that were imported from distant countries at enormous expense to create scents that barely masked the underlying human decomposition. Your perfume application involves rubbing aromatic oils and powders directly onto your unwashed skin and filthy clothing, creating a temporary olfactory illusion that you're clean while the underlying hygiene problems continue to fester and worsen. Medieval people genuinely believed that strong artificial scents could prevent disease transmission and improve health outcomes, leading to perfume practices that were considered medical treatments rather than cosmetic luxuries. The medieval perfume industry was built around the fundamental reality that everyone smelled terrible and needed chemical assistance to participate in polite society. Perfumers were highly skilled craftspeople who specialized in creating scent combinations powerful enough to overcome the most challenging body odors, making their profession essential for social functions, business meetings, and religious ceremonies where people had to tolerate close proximity to unwashed bodies. Common people who couldn't afford expensive perfumes used cheaper alternatives, including burning herbs, carrying aromatic sachets, and applying various folk remedies that ranged from mildly effective to completely useless. These budget fragrance solutions included rubbing garlic on clothing, carrying bags of dried flowers, and using various animal fats mixed with local plants to create homemade scents that often smelled worse than the original body odor. Medieval religious authorities had complex relationships with perfume use, simultaneously condemning vanity and artificial beautification, while acknowledging that some scent masking was necessary for people to participate in religious services without causing mass nausea among congregations. Churches developed their own aromatic traditions, including incense burning, that served partly to mask the overwhelming smell of unwashed worshippers packed into confined spaces. The psychological effects of medieval perfume use were significant because pleasant scents provided temporary relief from the constant olfactory assault of daily life, creating brief moments of sensory pleasure in environments that were otherwise overwhelmingly disgusting. People became psychologically dependent on artificial fragrances as escapes from the reality of living in communities where everyone smelled like decomposing organic matter. Your perfume routine is expensive, time-consuming, and ultimately futile because no amount of artificial fragrance can truly mask the complex bouquet of odors produced by months of accumulated filth, dental decay, and various bodily functions that have been fermenting in your clothing and hair. The scents you're applying provide temporary improvement that fades within hours, leaving you smelling like a combination of flowers and corpse that's somehow more disturbing than simple body odor. Historians still argue whether medieval perfume use was primarily driven by health beliefs or social conventions, but you're discovering that regardless of motivation, artificial scents were essential survival tools for anyone who wanted to participate in medieval society without causing immediate social exile. Your minor cut from yesterday becomes today's potential death sentence when you seek treatment from a medieval physician whose understanding of medical hygiene is so fundamentally flawed that his cure will almost certainly be more dangerous than your original injury. The medieval medical establishment operated under principles that would be considered criminal malpractice by modern standards, combining genuine anatomical ignorance with sanitation practices that guaranteed infection and often death from the simplest treatable conditions. Medieval doctors approached your wound with hands that haven't been washed in weeks, using instruments that have been used on dozens of previous patients without any cleaning between procedures, while working in environments that would be classified as biological hazard zones by any modern health authority. The concept of sterile medical procedures was completely unknown, making every medical intervention a guaranteed introduction of new bacteria and diseases into your already compromised health situation. Your physician begins treatment by examining your wound with unwashed fingers that have recently handled other patients' bodily fluids, animal waste, and various contaminated substances, immediately introducing new forms of infection directly into your bloodstream. Medieval medical practice included no understanding of disease transmission, bacterial contamination, or basic hygiene principles that could prevent medical procedures from becoming death sentences for patients seeking help. The medical instruments being used on your wound include knives, needles, and other tools that have been stored in contaminated environments and used on previous patients without any sterilization attempts, making every medical procedure essentially a game of infectious disease roulette, where you're guaranteed to acquire new health problems, regardless of whether your original condition improves. Medieval wound treatment involved applying various poultices and ointments made from ingredients that ranged from genuinely helpful to actively toxic, including mixtures of animal dung, rotting organic matter, and plant extracts that often cause severe infections and poisoning. These treatments were based on medical theories that had no connection to actual anatomy or disease processes, making medieval medicine essentially organized superstition performed with dangerous implements. Your physician's diagnostic methods include examining your urine color, checking your pulse at various body locations, and consulting astrological charts to determine the cosmic influences affecting your health, while completely ignoring obvious signs of infection and contamination that would be immediately recognizable to modern medical students. Medieval medicine was more concerned with theoretical explanations than practical results, leading to treatments that consistently made patients worse. The medical facility where you're receiving treatment doubles as a barbershop, tavern, and general meeting place, ensuring that your open wound is exposed to maximum contamination from multiple sources while you're trying to receive healing care. Medieval medical practice took place in environments that were specifically designed to spread disease and contamination, making hospitals and clinics more dangerous than leaving injuries untreated. Bloodletting represents the pinnacle of medieval medical ignorance, involving the deliberate removal of significant amounts of blood from patients who are already weakened by injury and infection, using contaminated instruments that introduce additional diseases while weakening your body's ability to fight existing health problems. This practice was considered the most advanced medical treatment available and was applied to virtually every condition, regardless of symptoms or severity. Historians still argue whether medieval medical practices were primarily based on classical texts or folk traditions, but you're experiencing the deadly reality that regardless of theoretical foundation, medieval medicine was systematically designed to kill patients through contamination, toxic treatments, and procedures that ignored basic biological reality. Your evening meal preparation reveals why medieval kitchens were essentially biological weapons laboratories that transformed potentially edible ingredients into disease delivery systems through food handling practices that would horrify modern health inspectors. The medieval kitchen where you're preparing dinner operates without any understanding of food safety, bacterial contamination, or hygiene principles that could prevent meals from becoming poison, served on contaminated plates to unsuspecting families. Medieval food preparation begins with ingredients that have already been compromised by inadequate storage, contaminated transportation, and handling by multiple unwashed people who view food safety as an incomprehensible modern concept. Your meat has been sitting in warm temperatures for days without refrigeration, developing bacterial colonies that produce toxins capable of killing healthy adults within hours of consumption. while your vegetables have been fertilized with human waste and washed in contaminated water sources. Your cooking utensils include wooden spoons, clay pots, and metal implements that have been used for months without proper cleaning, accumulating layers of food residue, bacteria, and various organic contaminants that transform every meal into a microbiological experiment with potentially fatal outcomes. Medieval kitchens had no concept of sanitizing cooking equipment, making every pot and pan a repository of accumulated contamination from previous meals. The water you're using for cooking comes from the same sources used for sewage disposal, animal watering, and general community waste management, ensuring that every drop contains bacteria, parasites, and toxic substances that would be classified as hazardous materials by modern environmental standards. Boiling this water kills some bacteria, but concentrates heavy metals and chemical pollutants that cause different but equally serious health problems. Medieval food storage involves keeping ingredients in environments that provide perfect breeding conditions for rodents, insects, and various forms of mold and bacteria that contaminate food supplies while they're waiting to be cooked. Your pantry is essentially an ecosystem where multiple species of pests compete to consume and contaminate your food before you can eat it yourself. Cross-contamination in medieval kitchens is inevitable because the same surfaces, utensils, and preparation areas are used for raw meat, vegetables, and cooked foods without any cleaning between uses, creating efficient systems for transferring bacteria and parasites between different ingredients. Your cutting board has been used to butcher animals, prepare vegetables, and serve cooked meals, making it a biological hazard that guarantees food poisoning. The cooking process itself introduces additional contamination through smoke from fires fueled by animal dung, contaminated wood, and various organic materials that produce toxic fumes while adding carcinogenic particles to food that's already dangerous from bacterial contamination. Medieval cooking fires created indoor air pollution that would violate modern environmental regulations, while contributing to respiratory diseases and food contamination. Your serving dishes and eating utensils are made from porous materials that absorb food particles and bacteria, making thorough cleaning impossible even if proper cleaning methods were available, which they're not. Medieval tableware becomes increasingly contaminated with each use, turning dinner plates into biological hazards that introduce new diseases with every meal. Food preservation methods in medieval times include salting, smoking, and drying techniques that often fail to prevent spoilage, while adding new forms of contamination through exposure to insects, rodents, and environmental pollutants that make preserved foods more dangerous than fresh ingredients. Your preserved meat has developed textures and flavors that indicate advanced decomposition, masked by salt and spices. Historians still argue whether medieval food poisoning deaths were primarily caused by ingredient contamination or preparation methods, but you're experiencing both problems simultaneously while preparing a meal that's virtually guaranteed to cause illness, regardless of your cooking skills or ingredient quality. Your visit to the local barber-surgeon reveals the horrifying medieval practice of combining haircuts with major medical procedures in the same unsanitary environment, using the same contaminated tools, creating a unique form of healthcare delivery that managed to be simultaneously cosmetic and potentially fatal. The medieval barbershop operates as a combination salon, surgical suite, and torture chamber where routine grooming services are performed alongside tooth extractions, bloodletting, and minor surgery, using techniques that would be considered war crimes by modern medical standards. Your barber approaches with hands that have just finished cutting another customer's hair and are now preparing to perform dental surgery on your infected tooth, using the same razor that was used for shaving to probe around inside your mouth without any attempt at cleaning or sterilization between procedures. Medieval barber surgeons had no understanding of cross-contamination, making every visit to their establishments a guaranteed exposure to whatever diseases their previous customers might have been carrying. The barber's tools include razors, knives, and various metal implements that are stored in contaminated environments and used for multiple purposes, ranging from haircutting to surgical procedures, ensuring that every instrument carries bacteria and bodily fluids from previous patients directly into your open wounds. These tools are sharpened on stones that are never cleaned, maintained in toolkits that serve as bacterial reservoirs, and handled by practitioners whose medical training consists primarily of watching other barbers work. Medieval tooth extraction involves the barber gripping your infected tooth with crude metal pliers and applying brute force to rip it from your skull while you're fully conscious and experiencing every moment of the agony, since anesthesia won't be invented for several more centuries. The extraction process typically damages surrounding teeth, tears gum tissue, and creates open wounds that become infected immediately due to the contaminated environment and unsanitary tools being used. Your dental procedure takes place in full view of other customers who are waiting for haircuts, creating a public spectacle of medical torture that serves as entertainment for bored medieval people, while exposing everyone present to airborne bacteria and blood splatter from your surgical procedure. The barbershop doubles as a social gathering place where people discuss community affairs while watching their neighbors undergo painful medical procedures. Bloodletting represents the pinnacle of medieval medical ignorance, involving the deliberate cutting of veins to drain significant amounts of blood from patients who are already weakened by illness or injury. Using contaminated cutting tools that guarantee infection while weakening your body's ability to fight existing diseases. This procedure was considered advanced medical treatment and was applied to virtually every health condition, regardless of symptoms or patient needs. The barber's medical knowledge consists entirely of folk wisdom, superstitious beliefs, and techniques learned through apprenticeship with other equally ignorant practitioners, creating a medical tradition based on accumulated ignorance rather than scientific understanding. Medieval barber surgeons genuinely believed they were providing healing services while consistently making their patients worse through contaminated procedures and dangerous techniques. Your surgical wounds are treated with bandages made from cloth scraps that have been used on previous patients and stored in contaminated environments, ensuring that your healing process will be complicated by additional infections introduced through the treatment process itself. Medieval wound care involved reusing bandages, applying contaminated ointments, and following procedures that guaranteed secondary infections. The payment system for medieval barber surgery often involved bartering goods or services, rather than monetary transactions, making medical care accessible to poor people while ensuring that practitioners had little incentive to invest in better tools, cleaner facilities, or improve techniques that might reduce patient mortality rates. Historians still argue whether medieval barber surgeons provided net health benefits or caused more harm than good. But you're experiencing the reality that their services were essentially organized torture disguised as medical care, making visits to barbershops significantly more dangerous than leaving health problems untreated. Your weekly visit to the public bathhouse reveals why communal bathing facilities became legendary disease incubators that spread more illnesses than they prevented, transforming the simple act of washing into a biological Russian roulette game where participants were more likely to acquire new infections than achieve actual cleanliness. Medieval public baths operated on the revolutionary principle of sharing the same water among dozens of unwashed people without changing the liquid between users, creating bacterial soup that would be classified as hazardous waste by any modern health authority. The bathhouse you're entering contains several large wooden tubs filled with water that hasn't been changed in days, accumulating the bodily fluids, skin particles, and various secretions of everyone who has used the facility since the last water replacement, which occurs infrequently due to the enormous labor required to heat and transport large quantities of water. This communal bathing system ensures that each person who enters the water is soaking in the concentrated filth of dozens of previous bathers. Your fellow bathers include people suffering from various skin diseases, open wounds, and infectious conditions that are now sharing their pathogens directly with everyone else in the contaminated water, creating efficient disease transmission networks that spread illnesses faster than any other medieval institution. The bathhouse serves as a biological mixing bowl where different strains of bacteria, fungi, and parasites combine to create new hybrid infections that are resistant to whatever primitive treatments might be available. Medieval bathhouse regulations, where they existed at all, focused primarily on moral concerns about mixed-gender bathing rather than health and safety issues, allowing facilities to operate under sanitary conditions that would be considered criminal negligence by modern standards. The authorities were more concerned about preventing sexual impropriety than preventing disease transmission, making bathhouse visits legally acceptable but medically catastrophic. The water heating process involves burning whatever fuel is available, including animal dung, contaminated wood, and various organic materials that produce toxic fumes while heating water that's already contaminated with sewage and industrial waste. The heating kills some bacteria while concentrating heavy metals and chemical pollutants that cause different but equally serious health problems for anyone exposed to the heated, contaminated water. Your bathing experience includes sharing soap made from animal fat and caustic ash with other bathers, using the same bar of harsh cleaning compound that has been rubbed on dozens of unwashed bodies and contaminated with whatever diseases those people might be carrying. This shared soap system guarantees cross-contamination while providing minimal cleaning benefits due to the soap's harsh chemical composition. The bathhouse atmosphere is thick with steam that carries airborne bacteria and toxic fumes from contaminated water and fuel sources, creating respiratory hazards that cause immediate coughing and long-term lung damage for anyone who spends significant time in the facility. Breathing in a medieval bathhouse means inhaling concentrated biological and chemical contamination that would require hazmat suits for safe exposure in modern contexts. Drying facilities in medieval bathhouses consist of shared towels that have been used by multiple previous bathers and stored in contaminated environments, ensuring that the final step of your bathing process involves rubbing your supposedly clean skin with fabric that's loaded with bacteria and parasites from other people's bodies. These shared towels effectively recontaminate your skin immediately after bathing. The social aspects of medieval public bathing created environments where people discussed business, conducted negotiations, and maintained social relationships while soaking in each other's bodily fluids, normalizing disease transmission as the price of participating in community social life. Bathhouses served important social functions that made their health risks seem acceptable to people who had limited understanding of disease transmission. Historians still argue whether medieval public baths were primarily social institutions or hygiene facilities, but you're discovering that regardless of their intended purpose, they functioned primarily as disease distribution centers that made participants dirtier and sicker than before they entered the contaminated water. Your medieval workplace exposes you to occupational hazards that would result in immediate facility closure and criminal charges in any modern context. As you handle toxic materials, dangerous chemicals, and contaminated substances without any protective equipment, while working in environments that systematically poison everyone involved in medieval industrial production. Medieval jobs were essentially elaborate suicide missions disguised as economic opportunities, combining deadly working conditions with complete ignorance of safety procedures that could prevent workplace deaths. Your daily labor involves handling raw wool that's contaminated with sheep parasites, toxic plant dyes, and various chemical treatments that cause skin irritation, respiratory problems, and long-term health effects that weren't understood until centuries after they'd killed thousands of medieval workers. The textile industry operated without any understanding of chemical safety, exposing workers to substances that modern industry would classify as extremely hazardous materials, requiring specialized handling procedures. Medieval metalworking exposes you to lead, mercury, and various other heavy metals that cause immediate poisoning and long-term neurological damage, while the smelting processes produce toxic fumes that guarantee respiratory diseases for anyone working in proximity to furnaces and forges. Metal workers suffered from characteristic symptoms of heavy metal poisoning that were considered normal occupational hazards rather than preventable workplace injuries. Your work environment includes no ventilation systems, safety equipment, or protective clothing that could reduce exposure to the various toxins, carcinogens, and biological hazards that define medieval industrial processes. Workers handled dangerous materials with bare hands, breathed contaminated air without masks, and worked in conditions that would require extensive safety protocols and protective equipment in modern contexts. Medieval food processing work involves handling meat from diseased animals, grain contaminated with ergot fungus, and various agricultural products that carry parasites and bacterial contamination directly from farms to processing facilities where workers are exposed to concentrated biological hazards. Food workers suffered from characteristic diseases caused by constant exposure to contaminated agricultural products. The leather tanning industry represents the pinnacle of medieval workplace horror, involving the use of animal urine, brain matter, and various toxic chemicals to process animal hides in environments that produce overwhelming smells and toxic fumes while exposing workers to biological hazards that would require hazmat suits for safe handling. Leather workers had shorter lifespans and higher disease rates than almost any other medieval occupation. Your workplace includes no safety training, accident prevention procedures, or emergency medical care for the injuries and illnesses that regularly occur during medieval industrial work, making every day a survival challenge where workers are expected to continue laboring despite conditions that would be considered torture in modern contexts. Workplace injuries were treated as personal failures rather than systemic safety problems. Medieval construction work involves lifting massive stones, working at dangerous heights, and using primitive tools that regularly cause serious injuries and deaths. While the construction materials themselves often contain toxic substances that cause long-term health problems for everyone involved in building projects. Construction workers had life expectancies significantly shorter than the general population due to accident rates and toxic exposures. The economic pressures of medieval work mean that you can't refuse dangerous assignments or demand safer working conditions without losing your livelihood and potentially starving, creating systems where workers are forced to choose between immediate death from starvation and slower death from occupational diseases and injuries. Medieval labor relations were essentially organized exploitation, disguised as economic opportunity. Mining operations expose workers to cave-ins, toxic gases, and various underground hazards that regularly kill entire crews, while the materials being extracted often contain heavy metals and radioactive substances that cause long-term health problems for anyone involved in extraction and processing activities. Medieval miners had some of the shortest lifespans and highest mortality rates of any occupational group. Historians still argue whether medieval workplace dangers were primarily caused by technological limitations or economic exploitation, but you're experiencing the deadly combination of both factors that made medieval employment essentially a choice between different methods of premature death. Your spiritual hygiene practices create a fascinating conflict between religious teachings that simultaneously demand bodily purity while condemning excessive attention to physical cleanliness as vanity and sin, leaving medieval Christians trapped in theological contradictions that made proper hygiene both spiritually necessary and potentially heretical. The medieval church's relationship with cleanliness created impossible standards that guaranteed spiritual anxiety while providing no practical guidance for maintaining health through basic sanitation practices. Medieval religious authorities taught that the body was a temporary vessel for the soul, and that excessive concern with physical comfort represented sinful attachment to worldly pleasures, leading to religious doctrines that actively discouraged bathing, grooming, and other hygiene practices that might be considered vain or self-indulgent. This spiritual framework made cleanliness a potential sin, while ignoring the health consequences of deliberate filthiness. Your religious obligations include various purification rituals that focus on spiritual cleanliness, while completely ignoring physical contamination, creating ceremonial washing practices that involve token amounts of water applied to small body areas, while leaving the majority of your accumulated filth completely untouched. These ritual purifications provided spiritual benefits, while offering no actual hygiene improvements. Medieval monasteries developed complex rules around bathing that allowed occasional washing for health reasons, while strictly regulating the frequency, duration, and time and circumstances under which monks could clean their bodies, creating institutional hygiene policies that balance spiritual discipline with basic survival needs. Monastic communities had better hygiene than general populations, but still suffered from disease rates that would be preventable through modern sanitation practices. The concept of ritual pollution in medieval Christianity meant that certain activities, foods, and bodily functions required spiritual cleansing that had no connection to actual contamination or disease prevention, leading to purification practices that addressed imaginary spiritual problems while ignoring real biological hazards. Medieval people spent more effort on spiritual hygiene than physical cleanliness. Your participation in religious services involves close contact with dozens of unwashed people in confined spaces where disease transmission is inevitable, while the spiritual benefits of communal worship are undermined by the biological reality that churches function as disease incubators, where faithful Christians infect each other with various illnesses through shared breathing and physical contact during services. Medieval religious teachings about suffering as spiritual discipline led to practices that deliberately maintained uncomfortable living conditions, including poor hygiene, as methods for building character and demonstrating devotion to God, rather than attachment to worldly comfort. This theological framework made cleanliness spiritually suspicious, while elevating filthiness to a form of religious practice. Holy water used in religious ceremonies comes from the same contaminated sources as all other medieval water supplies, making sacred rituals involving water consumption or contact potential sources of disease transmission disguised as spiritual healing practices. The blessed water was often more contaminated than regular water due to storage conditions and repeated use in ceremonial contexts. Your religious dietary restrictions include fasting periods and food limitations that compromise your nutritional status and weaken your immune system while providing no health benefits, making religious observance a contributing factor to disease susceptibility rather than a source of protection from illness. Medieval religious practices often made people sicker rather than healthier. The medieval belief that disease was punishment for sin created theological explanations for illness that prevented people from seeking practical solutions to preventable health problems, leading to religious responses to medical crises that focused on prayer and penance rather than hygiene and treatment. This spiritual framework made disease seem inevitable rather than preventable. Historians still argue whether medieval religious attitudes toward cleanliness were primarily influenced by classical philosophy or practical considerations, but you're experiencing religious teachings that create impossible conflicts between spiritual obligations and basic health maintenance, making it difficult to be both religiously observant and physically healthy simultaneously. Your medieval childhood hygiene experiences reveal why most children didn't survive to adulthood, as youngsters were subjected to cleaning practices so inadequate and dangerous that basic childhood development became a survival challenge that claimed more young lives than warfare, famine, or natural disasters combined. Medieval child-rearing included no understanding of pediatric hygiene needs, creating childcare practices that systematically endangered children's health, while parents genuinely believed they were providing appropriate care. Medieval infants were wrapped in cloth swaddling that was rarely changed or cleaned, creating warm, moist environments perfect for bacterial growth, while restricting movement that could help children develop healthy circulation and muscle tone. These swaddling practices trapped waste products against babies' skin for extended periods, causing infections and skin conditions that often proved fatal in an era without effective medical treatments. Your childhood bathing consisted of occasional cold water rinses that removed visible dirt while leaving bacterial contamination completely untouched, creating an illusion of cleanliness that provided no actual health benefits, while exposing children to waterborne diseases through contaminated washing water. Medieval children were essentially never properly cleaned during their entire developmental period. Medieval childcare practices included no understanding of the connection between hygiene and disease prevention, leading to parenting techniques that inadvertently exposed children to maximum biological hazards, while parents remained completely unaware that their caregiving methods were endangering their children's lives. Well-meaning parents were systematically killing their children through ignorance. Your childhood diet consisted of adult food that was inappropriate for developing digestive systems, served in contaminated containers, using utensils that harbored bacteria and parasites, while food preparation for children included no special hygiene considerations that could prevent the food poisoning that regularly killed medieval youngsters. Children ate the same contaminated food as adults, but had less developed immune systems to handle the bacterial challenges. Medieval children's clothing was rarely washed and often consisted of hand-me-down garments that had accumulated years of contamination from previous wearers, creating clothing systems that served as repositories of bacterial and parasitic contamination that continuously reinfected children with various diseases and skin conditions. Children's clothes were essentially wearable disease incubators. Your childhood sleeping arrangements involved sharing beds and sleeping surfaces with multiple family members, ensuring that children were exposed to every disease and parasite that affected adult household members, while providing no protection from the contamination that characterized medieval sleeping environments. Children's sleep was constantly interrupted by the biological hazards present in shared sleeping spaces. Medieval toilet training involved teaching children to use the same contaminated latrine facilities as adults, exposing developing immune systems to concentrated biological hazards, while providing no instruction about hygiene practices that could reduce disease transmission. Children learned to accept contamination as normal rather than developing healthy cleaning habits. The high childhood mortality rate in medieval times was largely attributable to hygiene-related diseases that would be easily preventable through basic sanitation practices, but medieval parents had no understanding of disease prevention and often interpreted child deaths as divine will rather than consequences of inadequate care practices. Parents grieved for children without understanding that better hygiene could have saved their lives. Your childhood medical care consisted of the same dangerous treatments applied to adults, including bloodletting, toxic herbal remedies, and contaminated wound care that often killed children who might have survived their original illnesses if left untreated. Medieval pediatric medicine was more dangerous than no medical care at all. Medieval childhood education included no instruction about personal hygiene, disease prevention, or health maintenance, ensuring that children who survived to adulthood would repeat the same dangerous practices with their own children, perpetuating cycles of hygiene ignorance that maintained high mortality rates across generations. Historians still argue whether medieval childhood mortality was primarily caused by disease, malnutrition, or inadequate care. But you're experiencing the reality that poor hygiene was the underlying factor that made all other childhood hazards more dangerous and often fatal. Your weekly trip to the medieval marketplace reveals why food shopping was essentially a game of biological Russian roulette, where contaminated vendors sold poisonous products to desperate customers who had no choice except to purchase whatever rotting merchandise was available, regardless of obvious signs of decay and disease that would trigger immediate health department intervention in modern contexts. Medieval markets operated without any food safety regulations, quality control standards, or hygiene requirements that could protect consumers from the inevitable food poisoning. Medieval food vendors handle their products with unwashed hands that have recently touched money, animal waste, and various other contaminated substances, ensuring that every food item is covered with bacteria and parasites before it reaches customers who have no way to clean their purchases before consumption. The vendors themselves are walking disease vectors who contaminate everything they touch while showing no awareness of hygiene principles that could reduce food contamination. Your food shopping takes place in an open-air market where meat sits exposed to flies, dust, and various environmental contaminants, while developing bacterial colonies that produce visible slime and overwhelming odors that indicate advanced decomposition. But customers continue purchasing these obviously spoiled products because alternatives aren't available and starvation is the only other option. Medieval markets sold food that was essentially biological weapons disguised as nutrition. The vegetables available for purchase have been fertilized with human waste, transported in contaminated containers, and stored in environments that maximize bacterial growth, while vendors make no attempt to remove obviously rotten portions or warn customers about potential health hazards. Medieval produce shopping involved accepting contamination as an inevitable aspect of food acquisition, rather than a preventable health risk. Medieval food storage at market stalls involves keeping perishable products in conditions that accelerate spoilage, while attracting rodents, insects, and other pests that add their own contamination to food supplies that are already dangerous for human consumption. Market stalls are essentially outdoor buffets for every form of pest and parasite in the medieval ecosystem. Your grain purchases include wheat and barley that have been contaminated with ergot fungus, rodent droppings, and various other substances that cause hallucinations, convulsions, and death when consumed. But medieval people had no understanding of grain contamination and regularly purchased infected grain that would be classified as toxic waste by modern agricultural standards. Medieval bread was often psychoactive and sometimes fatal. The dairy products available at medieval markets include milk and cheese from diseased animals, processed using contaminated equipment, and stored without refrigeration in conditions that guarantee bacterial growth, while vendors have no understanding of dairy safety principles that could prevent the tuberculosis and other diseases commonly transmitted through contaminated dairy consumption. Medieval spice vendors offer exotic seasonings that have been adulterated with cheaper substances, contaminated during transportation, and stored in conditions that encourage mold growth, while charging premium prices for products that often contain more contaminants than actual spices. Medieval spice shopping involved paying luxury prices for contaminated products of questionable authenticity. Your market transactions involve handling coins that have been touched by hundreds of contaminated hands, while conducting business in environments where money serves as an efficient disease transmission medium that spreads illnesses between vendors and customers through shared handling of contaminated currency. Medieval commerce was essentially organized disease transmission disguised as economic activity. The market atmosphere includes overwhelming smells from decomposing food, unwashed people, and animal waste that create olfactory environments so toxic they would require breathing protection in modern contexts, while customers and vendors conduct business while breathing air that's thick with airborne bacteria and toxic fumes from rotting organic matter. Medieval food preparation advice from vendors includes no information about proper storage, cooking temperatures, or safety precautions that could reduce the health risks associated with contaminated food purchases, leaving customers completely unprepared to minimize the dangers of consuming products that are already loaded with bacteria and toxins. Historians still argue whether medieval food contamination was primarily caused by poor storage or inadequate transportation, but you're experiencing the reality that every aspect of medieval food distribution was designed to maximize contamination, while providing no protection for consumers who had no choice except to eat whatever dangerous products were available. Your exploration of wealthy medieval households reveals that even the richest nobles lived in conditions that would be considered squalid by modern homeless shelter standards, despite having access to the most advanced hygiene technologies and expensive cleaning products available in their era. Medieval luxury hygiene represents the absolute pinnacle of what was possible with period technology and unlimited financial resources. Yet these elite practices would still horrify anyone accustomed to basic modern sanitation standards. Wealthy medieval families could afford to bathe monthly rather than annually, using imported soaps made from exotic ingredients and heated water that had been filtered through cloth to remove the largest visible contaminants, creating bathing experiences that were marginally less dangerous than communal bathhouses, while still involving contaminated water and harsh cleaning products that caused skin damage and chemical burns. Your wealthy household includes servants, whose job responsibilities include emptying chamber pots, handling contaminated laundry, and maintaining primitive hygiene facilities. But these servants have no training in sanitation principles and often spread contamination while attempting to provide cleaning services. Wealthy people's hygiene was maintained by poor people, who had even less access to clean water and proper cleaning supplies. Medieval noble families possessed multiple sets of clothing made from finer fabrics that were replaced more frequently than commoners' garments. But even luxury medieval textiles were subject to the same fundamental problems of inadequate cleaning methods and contaminated water sources that made all medieval clothing essentially unwearable by modern standards. Rich people's clothes were simply better quality versions of the same filthy garments that everyone else wore. Your aristocratic dining experiences include meals prepared by professional cooks using expensive ingredients and elaborate presentation techniques. But medieval luxury cuisine was still prepared without understanding of food safety principles and served in environments that guaranteed contamination regardless of the cost and sophistication of the ingredients and preparation methods. Wealthy medieval households could afford private latrines rather than communal facilities, providing more privacy and slightly better waste management. But these luxury toilet facilities still operated without understanding of sanitation principles and often dumped waste directly into water sources that served other community needs. Rich people's bathroom facilities were marginally less disgusting versions of the same dangerous waste management systems used by everyone else. Your noble family's medical care includes access to university-trained physicians rather than local folk healers. But medieval academic medicine was based on the same fundamental ignorance of anatomy and disease that characterized all period medical practice, making expensive medical care only slightly more dangerous than cheap alternatives. Wealthy people could afford more elaborate methods of medical torture disguised as healing treatments. Medieval luxury perfumes and cosmetics available to wealthy households included exotic ingredients imported from distant countries at enormous expense. But these products were applied to unwashed bodies and contaminated clothing, creating artificial fragrance layers over biological decay that provided temporary olfactory relief without addressing underlying hygiene problems. Rich people smelled slightly better while remaining equally dirty. Your aristocratic household includes primitive ventilation systems, better lighting, and more spacious living arrangements that reduced some hygiene challenges while creating new problems related to heating, waste management, and maintenance of larger facilities that required more complex cleaning procedures. Wealthy people had more space to accumulate contamination while having marginally better resources for managing the resulting hygiene challenges. The social obligations of wealthy medieval families required participation in court functions, religious ceremonies, and business meetings where close contact with other people was unavoidable, making good hygiene essential for social success, while the available hygiene technologies were inadequate for achieving actual cleanliness. Rich people needed to be clean for social reasons, but lacked the technology to achieve genuine cleanliness. Historians still argue whether medieval wealth provided significant hygiene advantages or simply offered more expensive versions of the same inadequate practices available to everyone. But you're discovering that even unlimited financial resources couldn't overcome the fundamental technological and scientific limitations that made effective hygiene impossible, regardless of social status. Your winter hygiene experience reveals what medieval people considered cold weather a form of divine punishment that turned already impossible sanitation challenges into survival nightmares, where basic bodily functions became potentially fatal activities requiring heroic courage just to accomplish simple tasks like urination and defecation. Medieval winters transformed hygiene from merely dangerous to absolutely lethal, creating seasonal challenges that killed more people than warfare, disease, and accidents combined. Medieval winter bathing becomes completely impossible when water sources freeze solid for months at a time, eliminating even the minimal washing opportunities that existed during warmer seasons and forcing people to live in their accumulated filth for extended periods without any possibility of cleaning until spring temperatures returned. Winter hygiene consisted entirely of waiting for warmer weather while hoping that infections and diseases wouldn't kill you before bathing became possible again. Your winter clothing system involves wearing the same garments for months without removal, because undressing in unheated medieval buildings would cause immediate hypothermia and death. creating clothing arrangements that become progressively more contaminated and disgusting as winter progresses, while providing no opportunities for cleaning or changing. Medieval winter clothing was essentially wearable prisons that trapped people in their own accumulated filth. Medieval winter toilet facilities become unusable when waste freezes in latrines that are already overflowing from months of accumulation, forcing people to develop alternative waste disposal methods that usually involved throwing human excrement out windows into streets, where it accumulated in frozen piles until spring melting created massive sewage floods. Winter waste management consisted of storing human feces in living spaces or creating outdoor waste mountains. Your winter water supplies consist of melted snow and ice that contain concentrated pollution from months of accumulated contamination. While the melting process requires fuel that's expensive and scarce during winter months, when heating materials are needed for survival, rather than hygiene activities. Winter water was even more contaminated than summer supplies, while being more difficult and dangerous to obtain. Medieval winter food storage involves keeping potentially edible substances in freezing temperatures that prevent immediate spoilage, while creating preservation conditions that allow different forms of contamination to develop slowly over extended periods, making winter meals biological time bombs that exploded into food poisoning when spring temperatures allowed bacterial activity to resume. Winter food was essentially delayed action poison. Your winter skin care consists of applying animal fat and various organic substances to prevent frostbite, while creating insulation layers that trap bacteria and parasites against your skin for months at a time, making winter skin protection a choice between immediate death from cold exposure and slow death from skin infections and parasitic infestations. Medieval winter skin care was a form of biological warfare against your own body. Medieval winter air quality in heated buildings becomes toxic due to smoke from burning whatever combustible materials are available, including animal dung, contaminated wood, and various organic substances that produce poisonous fumes, while people are trapped indoors breathing concentrated pollution for months without ventilation. Winter indoor air was essentially poison gas that people breathed by choice rather than dying from cold exposure. Your winter sleeping arrangements involve sharing beds and body heat with multiple people and animals in unheated spaces, where condensation from breathing creates moisture that freezes inside buildings, making winter sleep a choice between hypothermia and sharing diseases with whatever creatures are available for warmth. Medieval winter sleeping was essentially organized disease transmission disguised as survival strategy. Medieval winter medical care becomes impossible when physicians can't travel to patients, and medical procedures can't be performed in freezing temperatures, leaving sick and injured people to survive winter months without any medical intervention, while hoping that spring would arrive before their conditions became fatal. Winter medical care consisted entirely of hoping to survive until warmer weather made treatment possible. The psychological effects of medieval winter hygiene challenges include depression, anxiety, and various mental health problems caused by living in conditions that would be considered torture by modern standards, while knowing that relief wouldn't come for months and might not come at all if winter killed you before spring arrived. Historians still argue whether medieval winter mortality was primarily caused by cold exposure or hygiene-related diseases. But you're experiencing the reality that winter hygiene challenges made all other survival problems more difficult and often fatal. Your attendance at medieval social gatherings reveals how every form of community interaction became a super spreader event where unwashed people shared diseases, parasites, and various biological hazards through close contact in confined spaces that were specifically designed to maximize disease transmission between attendees who had no understanding of infection prevention. Medieval social life was essentially organized biological warfare, disguised as entertainment and community bonding. Medieval feast halls and banquet facilities packed dozens of unwashed people into poorly ventilated spaces where the air becomes thick with exhaled bacteria, body odors, and toxic fumes from cooking fires, creating atmospheric conditions that guarantee disease transmission while participants celebrate religious holidays, weddings, and various social occasions. These gatherings function as efficient biological mixing chambers, where different strains of disease combine to create new hybrid infections. Where participation in medieval religious services involves joining hundreds of unwashed worshippers in churches and cathedrals, where communal prayers, shared religious objects, and close physical contact during ceremonies ensure that everyone leaves with whatever diseases other attendees brought to the service. Medieval religious gatherings were essentially prayer meetings that doubled as disease distribution centers where faith and infection were transmitted simultaneously. Medieval market days and trading events bring together people from multiple communities who share contaminated goods, handle the same objects, and conduct business in crowded environments where regional diseases spread rapidly between different populations, creating commercial networks that efficiently distributed both goods and pathogens across wide geographic areas. Medieval commerce was essentially organized disease transmission disguised as economic activity. Your attendance at medieval weddings and celebrations involved sharing food, drinks, and eating utensils with dozens of other guests who contribute their own bacterial contamination to communal meals, while participants unknowingly poison each other through shared consumption of contaminated refreshments. Medieval celebrations were essentially poisoning parties where guests infected each other while commemorating important life events. Medieval seasonal festivals and community gatherings create opportunities for maximum disease transmission, as entire villages and towns come together for prolonged periods of close contact, shared activities, and communal dining that ensure every participant is exposed to every disease present in the community. These festivals function as annual disease consolidation events, where regional health problems are distributed equally among all attendees. Your participation in medieval dancing and entertainment involves physical contact with multiple partners who share their perspiration, breath, and various bodily secretions through close contact activities that were specifically designed to bring people together in ways that maximized biological exchange. Medieval entertainment was essentially organized disease transmission disguised as recreational activity. Medieval guild meetings and professional gatherings bring together workers who share occupational diseases and workplace contamination while conducting business in environments where professional diseases spread rapidly between members of the same trade, creating industry-specific disease communities where certain illnesses become characteristic of particular occupations. Medieval professional networking was essentially organized occupational disease transmission. Your attendance at medieval judicial proceedings and public executions involves joining crowds of spectators who share diseases while witnessing legal proceedings that have often involved public torture and execution, creating entertainment events where audience members infected each other while watching other people suffer and die. Medieval justice was essentially public health disasters disguised as legal proceedings. Medieval hospitality customs require guests to share beds, eating utensils, and personal items with their hosts, creating social obligations that guarantee disease transmission between families, while participants believe they're demonstrating friendship and respect through practices that would be considered biological warfare by modern standards. Medieval hospitality was essentially organized infection disguised as politeness. The cumulative effect of medieval social life means that participating in community activities was essentially choosing between social isolation and inevitable disease exposure, making community membership a health hazard that killed people through the same social bonds that were supposed to provide mutual support and protection. Historians still argue whether medieval social gatherings provided net benefits or caused more harm than good. But you're experiencing the reality that medieval community life was systematically designed to spread disease through social interactions that were essential for economic survival and cultural participation. Your medieval urban living experience reveals why cities were essentially open sewers, disguised as human settlements, where waste management systems consisted of throwing everything from human excrement to dead animals directly into streets that served simultaneously as transportation networks, drainage systems, and garbage dumps. Medieval urban planning was based on the revolutionary concept of concentrating as many people as possible in the smallest possible space, while providing no infrastructure for managing the resulting waste, contamination, and disease transmission. Medieval city streets function as flowing rivers of human and animal waste mixed with garbage, industrial runoff, and decomposing organic matter that creates a toxic sludge underfoot, while residents navigate daily life by walking through concentrated biological hazards that would require hazmat suits for safe exposure in modern contexts. Your daily commute involves wading through other people's excrement while trying to conduct normal business activities. Your urban neighborhood's waste disposal system involves residents emptying chamber pots and garbage directly from upper-story windows into streets below, creating a random precipitation of human waste and organic debris that falls on pedestrians, while property owners assume that gravity and rainfall will eventually move their waste problems to someone else's location. Medieval urban waste management was essentially organized littering on an industrial scale. Medieval city drainage systems consist of open channels that carry sewage, industrial waste, and runoff through residential areas, where the contaminated water moves slowly through urban environments, while residents use the same channels for drinking water, cooking, and washing activities. These drainage systems efficiently distribute contamination throughout urban areas while providing no separation between waste disposal and water supply. Your urban housing situation involves living in multi-story buildings where dozens of families share minimal space, while waste from upper floors drains through lower levels, creating vertical contamination systems where residents on different floors contribute to each other's hygiene problems through shared waste management failures. Medieval urban housing was essentially organized contamination disguised as shelter. Medieval urban air quality consists of smoke from thousands of individual cooking fires, industrial operations, and waste-burning activities that combine to create atmospheric pollution so thick it reduces visibility, while causing respiratory problems that would violate every modern environmental regulation. Urban air was essentially poison gas that residents breathed by necessity rather than choice. Your city's water supply comes from sources that also receive sewage disposal, industrial waste, and runoff from urban streets, ensuring that urban water consumption involves drinking concentrated pollution from hundreds of households and businesses that treat water sources as convenient waste disposal locations. Medieval urban water was essentially liquid sewage disguised as drinking water. Medieval urban pest control involves sharing living spaces with enormous populations of rats, insects, and various other creatures that thrive in contaminated urban environments, while spreading diseases between human residents through direct contact and contamination of food supplies. Urban pest populations were essentially parallel civilizations that competed with humans for food and space. Your urban work environment involves industries that dump waste products directly into streets and waterways, while workers handle toxic materials without protection, and residents live in close proximity to industrial pollution that would require extensive safety protocols in modern contexts. Medieval urban industry was essentially organized environmental destruction disguised as economic activity. Medieval urban social services consist of charitable organizations that provide minimal assistance while operating under the same contaminated conditions that characterize all other urban activities, making relief efforts essentially contaminated charity that often spread diseases while attempting to provide assistance. Urban charity was essentially organized disease transmission disguised as humanitarian aid. The psychological effects of medieval urban living include constant stress from overcrowding, noise, contamination, and disease exposure that create mental health problems, while residents have no escape from urban conditions that would be considered psychological torture by modern standards. Medieval urban life was essentially organized stress production disguised as civilization. Urban mortality rates in medieval cities exceeded rural death rates significantly, making city living essentially a choice between economic opportunities and premature death through disease exposure that was unavoidable for anyone who participated in urban economic and social life. Historians still argue whether medieval urban problems were primarily caused by overpopulation or inadequate technology. But you're experiencing the reality that medieval cities were essentially death traps, disguised as economic opportunities, where residents traded life expectancy for access to commercial and cultural activities. Your final realization about medieval hygiene reveals the overwhelming truth that poor sanitation was the silent killer that claimed more lives than all the wars, famines, and natural disasters combined, systematically destroying human health through preventable diseases that were considered normal aspects of daily life rather than tragic consequences of ignorance about basic biological principles. Medieval hygiene wasn't just inadequate, it was the primary cause of human suffering and early death that made life expectancy so short that most people died before experiencing what modern humans would consider a full lifespan. The cumulative health effects of medieval hygiene practices created a cascade of interconnected problems, where poor sanitation led to weakened immune systems that made people vulnerable to diseases that further compromised their ability to maintain even basic cleanliness, creating downward spirals of deteriorating health that inevitably ended in premature death from conditions that would be easily preventable through simple hygiene improvements. Your medieval life expectancy reflects the brutal reality that most people died in their 30s or 40s from hygiene-related diseases, including dysentery, typhoid, cholera, plague, and various parasitic infections that were transmitted through contaminated water, food, and living environments that could have been made safer through basic sanitation knowledge that wouldn't be developed for several more centuries. Medieval society's complete ignorance of bacterial theory, disease transmission, and infection prevention meant that every aspect of daily life was systematically designed to maximize health risks, while people remained completely unaware that their cleaning practices, waste management, and food handling were essentially organized suicide disguised as normal living activities. Medieval people were killing themselves through ignorance while believing they were following appropriate health practices. The social and economic costs of medieval hygiene failures included enormous amounts of human potential lost to preventable diseases, communities devastated by epidemics that could have been avoided through basic sanitation, and civilizational development slowed by the constant burden of caring for sick people and replacing dead workers. Poor hygiene wasn't just a personal health problem, it was a societal disaster that affected every aspect of medieval civilization. Your understanding of medieval hygiene challenges reveals why the development of modern sanitation systems represents one of humanity's greatest achievements, transforming human health outcomes more dramatically than any medical breakthrough by simply preventing diseases rather than trying to cure them after infection had already occurred. Modern hygiene knowledge has saved more lives than all other medical advances combined. Medieval hygiene practices created intergenerational cycles of poor health, where parents who survived childhood diseases passed their weakened health and hygiene ignorance to children who faced the same preventable health challenges, making poor sanitation a hereditary problem that affected entire family lines across multiple generations. Medieval hygiene ignorance was essentially inherited biological warfare that families conducted against themselves. The psychological trauma of medieval hygiene included constant awareness of bodily discomfort, social embarrassment from unavoidable odors and appearance problems, and anxiety about health threats that seemed unpredictable and unavoidable because people had no understanding of disease prevention through cleanliness. Medieval people lived in constant fear of health problems they could have prevented through basic hygiene knowledge. Your medieval hygiene journey demonstrates why access to clean water, effective soap, proper waste management, and basic sanitation knowledge represents fundamental human rights that modern people often take for granted, while remaining unaware of how recently these life-saving technologies became available to ordinary people. Modern hygiene represents a historical miracle that transformed human existence. The contrast between medieval and modern hygiene reveals the enormous importance of scientific education, public health infrastructure, and technological development in creating conditions where human beings can live healthy, comfortable lives rather than struggling constantly against preventable diseases that made medieval existence essentially a prolonged battle against biological hazards. As you drift into the peaceful darkness of sleep tonight, surrounded by the miraculous cleanliness of modern life, you can appreciate the simple joy of clean sheets, fresh air, and a body that's been properly washed with effective soap and clean water. Your comfortable bed represents centuries of human progress in understanding health and hygiene, creating the safe, clean environment that allows you to rest peacefully without fear of the biological hazards that made medieval sleep a dangerous activity. The gentle sound of your modern ventilation system whispers stories of technological advancement that conquered the hygiene challenges that once made human life so brief and uncomfortable. Sweet dreams knowing that you live in an era when cleanliness protects rather than threatens your health, where hygiene knowledge prevents rather than causes suffering, and where the simple act of washing your hands represents humanity's triumph over the ignorance that once made survival itself and daily miracle requiring constant courage and extraordinary luck.